Hi, everybody. Welcome today to the last in our webinar series for this year. And today we have Elizabeth Letourneau and Andrew Harris talking about juvenile sex offender registration and notification, emerging research and implication for policy. I really want to welcome everyone, and it's really great to see so much interest in all of these webinars, but particularly in this topic. And for me, I know this topic has a lot of meaning because we are looking at policy for the first time, not just looking at practice, but how the interaction of the work that you do in practice is affected by the public policy in the U.S., and particularly for adolescents and youth with sexual behavior problems. For those who don't know NERI, our mission is to share the cutting-edge research and best practices emerging in our field. And for many years, we sold only books, but in the last 5 years, we've begun to offer online courses and newsletters that take one researcher article each month and put that into an easy-to-read newsletter that now most recently, sorry, I don't mean to, something appearing here. But anyway, take a newsletter, takes this research article and puts it into an easy-to-read piece that you can read over a cup of coffee is our logo. And now, so most recently, we're doing these webinars by some of our internationally registered, recognized authors. And we hope that you'll consider becoming a sponsor, and I'll talk a little bit about that towards the end of this webinar. And I really want to say that the kind of support by sponsors allows us to continue to bring these free resources. So thank you very much to everyone who is a sponsor. And I'm going to go through a little logistics, and like any other workshop, we have some housekeeping to do. So the first bit of business is to talk about our learning objectives. And we have 4 learning objectives for this workshop. First is we want to bring you enhanced awareness of the scope of public policies and how they apply to registration and public notification requirements for youth. We want to give an improved understanding of the empirical research surrounding the psychological and social impacts of registration and notification as applied to youth. Increase of attunement to the significant array of practice implications that registration and notification presents to those who are engaged in treatment, supervision, and assessment of juveniles who have sexually offended, and improved ability to advocate for effective forms of registration and notification laws to minimize impacts on effective youth and promoting public policy. Second, we want to let you know that the Prezi, if you didn't hear Greg's earlier piece, the Prezi presentation is posted now on the NERI Press webinar. So if you want to look at that, you can download that separately or just follow along with Elizabeth and Andrew. We'll also be posting a recording of this webinar next week. And also when the workshop is over, please be sure to close out your account. We'll be sending you an evaluation, and we would truly appreciate your feedback, but in order to get that evaluation, you have to close out the account. And finally, after about a week, we're going to send you a follow-up email that has a link to the recordings and also a link to the certificate of completion. And so typically, Greg, for some reason, I'm having a hard time showing the poll or getting back to things. So I'm going to just try this one more time. So excuse me to everyone who's seeing what I'm I'm showing here. Here we go. I think I've got it now. Okay, so the poll's open. So I just asked people if they could fill in this poll. I want to get a sense of whether or not you've attended a NERI Press webinar before. And it looks like we have about a third of you who have not attended before, and about 2/3 who have attended before. So thank you, that's great. And if you can, Greg, if you could show the results, that would be great. So we got 62% said yes, 38% said no. Thank you, I appreciate that. Probably most importantly now, I want to have a chance to introduce our speakers today. And really have had the pleasure to both work with Elizabeth and Andy for a number of years. And it's really 2 people who I really admire a lot in the field. So more briefly, Dr. Elizabeth Letourneau is an Associate Professor of Public Health at Johns Hopkins and also Director of the Moore Center for the Prevention of Child Sexual Abuse. She has 25 years of experience evaluating clinical and policy interventions and aimed at preventing the perpetration of child sexual abuse. She has served as the principal investigator on many federally and private funded projects looking at the effects of the current sex crime policies She's also been the lead investigator on the largest randomized control trial to date, which examines the treatment effectiveness of youth who have sexually offended. She's also the current president of the Association for the Treatment of Sexual Abusers in her free time, I guess. And second, Andy Harris is the Associate Dean and Associate Professor at the University of Massachusetts Lowell. He's an expert in public policy and has held several senior positions in both state and municipal government, and has served as a consultant on issues related to sex offender management, correctional programming, substance abuse services, and the criminal justice system. His research is focused on the implementation of public policies and at the intersection of criminal justice and health and human services. In recent years, Dr. Harris has served as a principal investigator for major projects looking at a range of issues from sexually abusive behaviors in youth as well as sexting. I really think that this is going to be a fabulous conversation today. I'm really looking forward to it. And I'm going to turn this over now to Andy and Elizabeth. So thanks, everybody, for attending. And welcome, Andy and Elizabeth.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Hopefully everyone can see my screen now.
I can see it. It's perfect, okay. Andy.
That's a beautiful thing. I've got to get rid of my little bar here. Okay. Great. Well, welcome everybody. What we're going to do today is Elizabeth and I are going to be a bit of a tag team, and we're really going to cover three major areas. The first is I'm going to spend some time talking very broadly about the policy context of juvenile registration and notification affecting youth, and talk a bit about federal state policies and kind of places in a very broad policy context. I'm then going to turn it over to Elizabeth, and she's going to spend some time discussing the research that's been done to date and what we know, what we don't know about the impacts of registration and notification as applied to youth, both in terms of public safety impacts and in terms of what we call collateral impacts, or the effects on both systems and on the youth who are affected. And the third part, which we are very excited to talk about because it's an ongoing project that we're both engaged in, has to do with a study that we're currently undertaking that we think really addresses a pivotal missing piece in the research literature. And we're going to spend some time talking about our existing study, what we're up to. We'll present some preliminary results, and then ask for your help in helping us move this project forward. So I'm going to begin with a broad policy context. Now, when we think about juvenile sex offender registration, very often what people automatically begin to think about is the federal policy. And until fairly recently, it was actually not a bad place to focus. And one of the reasons was that the Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act, and specifically Title I of that act that passed in 2006, called SORNA, it really took a pretty dramatic step in requiring that youth who are adjudicated delinquent for sexual offenses have registration and notification laws applied to them. And this is the language that comes from the original Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act in 2006. And following that act, the Department of Justice was asked to put out guidelines for the implementation. So this effectively took what was in the act and interpreted it for states to comply with.
Hey, Andy, this is Joan.
Yep.
Andy, this is Joan. If you could just speak a little bit louder. We're getting a few folks just saying it's a little bit harder to hear you. Okay.
Oh, sure. Okay. I will try to speak louder.
Okay. I know you can do it. So, Andy, we can't hear you at all now. Are you speaking? Andy, have we lost you now? So, I'm not sure, Elizabeth, you can take a step in here. Good. Andy, we're getting you back.
Can you hear me fine?
Now I can hear you. Can you speak a little bit louder?
Yeah, well, yeah.
Okay, great. Now I can hear you, though, yes.
You can hear me fine? Okay.
Yes.
So the guidelines, as they were put out, effectively require that juveniles who are adjudicated delinquent will be held to the same standards as adults when it comes to registration and notification. And this part that I have highlighted here in the green arrow was really kind of the piece that created really significant issues, because effectively it said that anybody who is adjudicated delinquent or convicted of a sexual act with a person under the age of 12 would be subject to effectively registration notification, whether or not they were a juvenile or an adult. And this obviously created significant issues for youth who sexually offend, because very often this piece about engaging in a sexual act with a child under the age of 12 would apply to a good number of youth who sexually offend. And it wasn't, it was no coincidence then that when the Department of Justice put their guidelines out, the vast majority of the roughly 800 pages of commentary that they received from states and from concerned citizens was around the juvenile provisions. And subsequent to that, there were a number of changes made. There were congressional hearings, and the final guidelines that were reissued sometime around 2009, effectively what the Department of Justice did was it pulled that last provision out. And so what was left was only in cases where somebody engaged in a sexual act with the use of force or a threat of serious violence, or engaged in a sexual act with another by rendering unconscious or involuntarily drugging a victim, became the sole criteria for applying these kinds of standards to youth. The other thing that the final guidelines came out with was a provision that moderated the requirement that youth are required to register juveniles who are adjudicated delinquent, simply because it involved a sexual act under the age of 12. In other words, if there are no significant aggravating circumstances like outlined above, simply having a victim under the age of 12 did not require juvenile registration. They further clarified it by stating very affirmatively that there was no remaining requirement under SORNA, under the federal law, that jurisdictions publicly disclose the information about youth who were adjudicated delinquent and who had those sex offense convictions. So the federal government really did kind of back off a lot of its earlier position around this. And so what that effectively meant was that it was left up to the states in a good measure about how they wanted to situate their laws around juvenile registration. And so it's really important when we think about the policy context to recognize that, well, there are federal guidelines and regulations here, but there also are very significant issues that are taking place across the state. And this is really where all of you who are listening today, should make it a point to really understand what it is that your state does and how it applies these laws. And there's wide variation. And I'm going to profile 3 states very quickly just to show some of the variation in how states have formulated their policies around the application of registration notification to youth. The state of Massachusetts, where I'm sitting today, does provide for juvenile registration, but it also requires that the registration of youth requires a separate hearing. So after the adjudication on a given offense, there's a separate hearing held in which determination is made by the judge about whether or not a youth should be subject. There also is risk assessment that takes place here, and so it would not be a youth would not be subject to registration solely on the basis of his or her offense. And then it also allows youth to petition for removal from the registry at some point. And in the overall spectrum of places that do allow for juvenile registration, and many states don't, about 37 states do, but 13 don't, I would put Massachusetts at the perhaps the less extreme end, and we actually have fewer youth register proportionally here than you'll find in other states. The state of California does require that the youth who are admitted to the custody of the California Youth Authority are required to register upon release, but they also protect youth who are solely adjudicated in juvenile court and not convicted in adult court from being subject to public disclosure. And then in a state such as Florida has, I would say, I would put them at the more sweeping extreme end of the spectrum. It does provide some discretion for the Florida Department of Law Enforcement around public internet disclosure, but youth who are adjudicated delinquent on sexual offenses and subject to registration will be subject to lifetime registration And compounding that, the state of Florida, along with many of its counties and local jurisdictions, has kind of these compounded residency restrictions that go on top of the registration piece. And so it's not just about having the youth show up in front of registration, it also has these very significant additional consequences. When we look across the country, we see that about 37 states do provide in some way, shape, or form provisions for youth who are adjudicated in juvenile court to be subject to sex offender registration. In 27 of these cases, it's mandatory. There's very little discretion, and about 10 of them, there's some what we call judicial discretion or discretion among prosecutors to decide whether or not youth should be subject to these provisions. So one of our key questions that we have to ask ourselves when we think about this policy context is how system actors are going to respond to this. And some of the research that Elizabeth's going to talk about in the next slide is going to get into some of these system issues. When you put these systems in place, how might systems adapt? Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth, and she's going to begin to walk you through some of the research.
Yeah, hi everyone, and Joan, thanks for the introduction. And just to let our listeners know, I'm speaking, but Andy's controlling the Prezi, this cool Prezi presentation, and so forgive me if there's a little bit of a gap between what I'm saying and what you're saying, but I'll try to stay on point here. So a lot of the research that my colleagues and I have been doing for the last 10 years has looked at the impacts of sex offender registration and notification as applied to juveniles. And so if we look at, Andy, are we starting with direct effects on juvenile offending? What colleagues have identified, both myself, Michael Caldwell, and I are really the two people who have done almost all of the research in this. Ashley Battistini has published a paper, but I think Michael and I are kind of responsible for most of the published research in this. And what we found in analyzing South Carolina's registration and notification policy, which is like Florida's, it's very broad, very sweeping. It lasts for life, and it includes quite a few types of sex offenses. So I based a lot of my research on South Carolina data, pulling data from a 15-year period of time that included 4 years before registration went into effect, and then years after registration, and then after notification went into effect. And at the time that we were doing our research in South Carolina, you can read the slide, but a good percentage of people on the registry were juveniles at the time of their offense. And South Carolina has no lower age limit for prosecuting youth for sex offenses, and so the youngest kid had been 8 at the time that he was adjudicated and 10 at the time that he went on the registry. And most are boys, of course, and African-American youth are overrepresented on our registry. Annie pointed out that the Anamal-Shorna Act law was fairly broadly written to include acts against younger children, and of course most acts for which youth are adjudicated are against peers or younger children, and so a lot of the kids on the South Carolina sex offender registry were adjudicated for criminal sexual conduct with a minor, not surprisingly, and lewd act with a child and those sorts of things. South Carolina's registry is so broad that you can get on it for non-sex offenses if you plead down. Normally pleading down means that you won't be on the registry, but in South Carolina, judges can actually place you on the registry, often at the request of the prosecution if you've successfully pled from a sex offense to an aggravated assault offense. So one of the first things that we looked at was whether this policy influences sex offender recidivism. For my money, registration and notification are designed specifically for community safety, and the way you reach community safety is through reducing recidivism of known offenders, or for designing a policy so that people who might be first-time offenders think twice about doing that. So we looked at those two outcomes, both recidivism and first-time offending. And again, we used data from South Carolina, a large sample of kids, over 1,200, And we looked for evidence of recidivism, either new arrests or new convictions, across about a 9-year follow-up, which means we were following these kids through their early 20s, so through the highest risk period for recidivism. And what we found, first of all, is that very few kids reoffended. And this is vitally important for our audience to be aware of. I'm sure you are, but sexual recidivism rates are very, very low. They're very low for juveniles. They're also low for adults, but if we focus on kids, most of us find low recidivism rates. This is not anomalous to South Carolina in any way. Michael Caldwell has done a couple of very nice meta-analyses on recidivism of youth, and it's typically below 10%, especially if you look at non-clinical samples, and you often get studies with below 5%. We had 2.5 reconviction rate for sex offenses, very small. And whether or not you were registered had absolutely no bearing on whether or not you reoffended. So there was no reduced recidivism. There was, however, an uptick in arrests for nonviolent misdemeanor level offenses for registered kids and not for non-registered kids who had also committed sex offenses. We've run 2 studies and we've found the same thing with both studies, which is that if you're registered, I think what happens is you suffer from a scarlet letter effect. I think people around you, both law enforcement as well as others, view you as dangerous, and they're more likely to report you or to arrest you for behaviors that ultimately are not illegal, because what we saw was increased arrests or charges for low-level offenses, but not increased convictions. If there were increased convictions, then it would suggest that registration maybe makes kids worse. We didn't find that. We found that it made them more likely to be picked up. And so we think that's because if you're registered, people are afraid of you, and they are more likely to kind of pull you in for questioning or to arrest you for behavior that ultimately is not illegal. As I mentioned, there's 2 ways to increase community safety. One is to reduce recidivism of known offenders, and the other is for a policy to impact first-time offenders, people who haven't yet committed an offense, and maybe will now think twice about it given this new policy. That's a common defense for capital punishment, that the risk of losing your own life makes you less likely to take someone else's. And so we looked at whether or not sex offender registration and notification deterred youth from committing their first sex offense. Again, we have very, very large sample sizes, and we also compared rates of first-time offenses for sex offenses with rates of first-time offenses for other serious person offenses as a way of controlling for kind of unknown factors that might influence juvenile violent offending in general. Violent offending, you should also know, in addition to the fact that there's low recidivism rates, sexual offending and non-sexual offending rates have declined substantially since 1990, and that's important and wonderful news for all of us. We've seen very large declines in child sexual abuse, including child sexual abuse perpetrated by youth. And we've also seen declines in other kinds of offending. So we wanted to make sure that given those historical declines, we were accounting for that. So when we looked for changes in first-time sex crimes, we found no differences before registration was enacted in 1995 and after registration was enacted in 1995. And then we also looked, just to be sure, after online notification was enacted in 1999 and found nothing. And so there's no deterrence of first-time sex crimes by South Carolina's policy. So we don't have any discernible effects on registration, on recidivism, with the exception of an uptick in arrests for misdemeanor level offenses, and we don't have any deterrent effects. And I will say that my colleague Michael Caldwell, who's really a wonderful researcher and a great writer, has also found no effect of either state level registration policies. He's looked at 4 different states, or at the formal tiering in the Adam Walsh Act. In fact, what Michael has found is that kids who would be tiered in the lowest tier tended to be more likely to reoffend with a general non-sexual offense than kids in the highest tier. So the Adam Walsh Act tiering had the effect of putting lower risk, high risk kids in lower tiers, oddly enough. And in fact, my colleagues and I found that exact same issue when we looked at adult data and looked at tiering. We found in Florida in particular, men who were in tier 1, the quote-unquote low-risk tier, were more likely to reoffend than men in the higher tiers. So it's not a very good method, not an accurate method for predicting recidivism. The other area that we looked at was how do these policies influence the judicial actors. And Andy, I'm sorry if I got out of order there. I think maybe I did. But we looked at whether or not registration and notification policies changed the way juvenile sex crime cases are handled in the courts. And so again, focusing on South Carolina data, we looked at the likelihood of a prosecutor moving forward with a sex crime case, a juvenile sex crime case, before and after registration and before and after notification. And as with our other studies, we looked also at the likelihood of moving forward on other serious juvenile offending offenses, assault and robbery crimes. Very large sample size, very long time frame. And what we found was, in fact, there was a huge reduction in the likelihood that a prosecutor would move forward on a juvenile sex crime case after South Carolina's lifetime registration policy went into effect. So in 1995, which is where you see that big dip, there was a 41% decline in the likelihood that they would move forward. So kids were either, these cases were dropped or dismissed or diverted. And you can see that the rate goes up over time, but we never get to the pre-notification level of moving forward on cases. And so a lot of these cases continue to be dropped or dismissed or diverted. And we looked at what happens if a prosecutor does, in fact, choose to move forward on a case. How does that case ultimately get prosecuted? And we looked specifically at plea bargains. And we looked at pleading both in terms of lower severity or to a different type of crime. In South Carolina, almost every sex crime lands you on the lifetime registry. So pleading to a lower severity sex crime is not a good strategy if your goal is to stay off of the registry. So we did find reductions in pleading in terms of severity, pleading to lower severity, but mostly that was because kids were pleading out of type to other types of crimes, typically aggravated or simple assault. And those crimes tend to hold lower severity ratings than sex crimes in general. So what we found was that before registration or notification was enacted, which is the 1990 to 1994 timeframe, about 10% of sex crimes were pled out of type, pled to an assault offense typically. Afterwards, that doubled, more than doubled to 25%. And then after online notification went into effect, which was 1999 to 2004, we saw another increase. Altogether, there was a 124% increase from no registration to registration, and then another 50% increase from registration to online notification. And you saw no differences in the robbery or the assault offenses. And so, indeed, judicial actors, I say prosecutors, but it's really the combination of prosecutors, defense attorneys, and judges permitting these kinds of plea bargains to take place. So what we found, again, with policy or with the judicial actors was significantly less likely to move forward on charges, much more likely to permit a downward plea to a non-sexual offense. So these policies do have significant impacts on how these cases are prosecuted. So just to summarize from our South Carolina research, we have a policy here that overwhelmingly targets low-risk kids. And by that I mean 2.5% reoffended, which means 97.5% of South Carolina youth adjudicated for a sex crime do not reoffend with another sex crime at least through their mid-20s. So we're targeting low-risk kids. We're failing to reduce sexual or violent recidivism. We increase their contact with law for non-serious charges, but not convictions. We don't have any effect on first-time sex offending. And we're deterring prosecutors from moving forward on cases and encouraging plea bargains. So the next steps of our research include a multi-state replication of that research. So we've got a study going on where we're collaborating with Maryland, Oregon, Texas, and Oklahoma to look at, to see if we find similar findings across those states. Those states each have very different registration notification policies. So that project is ongoing. And then the project that Andy and I are working on together is looking at the impact of registration and notification on youth and their family, the collateral consequences. And I'm going to hand it back over to Andy.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to in the interest of time, I'm going to run through these next set of slides relatively quickly to kind of set the stage for talking about our study. But the third kind of pod of research, I mean, Elizabeth's talked about the public safety impact, she's talked about the system impacts. Third pod, which really leads into what we're currently up to, focuses in on the impacts on registrants and their families. And to date, there's actually been almost no literature in the research around this. There have been studies of adult registered sex offenders that have shown all sorts of significant social impacts related to employment, housing, harassment, et cetera. And that's been fairly well documented. But until very recently, there's been no research at all on effects on youth. About a year ago, Human Rights Watch put out a report authored by Nicole Pittman where she went out and she interviewed about close to 300 young youth and young adults who were registered as youth. And she reported very significant negative psychological impacts, suicide attempts, etc. And this report is really well worth reading. If you go to Human Rights Watch website, you can find it. In fact, we can probably put a link up on the NERI website for people to get to. But I just wanted to kind of share just a few of the quotes that kind of begin to kind of put this issue into a context. This quote from Ted, who is 26 years old, placed on the registry at 14 for touching his younger cousin, talks about a general sense of hopelessness, suicidal thoughts, stigma and shame, and the fact that there's a sense that this is never going to be going away. Danielle talks about the way that her registration has kind of affected her self-image and the way people view her in a sexual way. This is the mother of a young man named Jonathan who actually was very prominently featured in the film that went along with the report, kind of talking about the shame and the stigma. And here's Joshua talking about the fact that sex offender registration is slow death by humiliation. This is a very powerful way of conveying this. And so what our research is designed to do is kind of build on the Human Rights Watch report. And in fact, the research is supported by the Open Society Foundations, which is the same group that supported Nicole Pittman's work. And our goal is to find a way to really empirically evaluate the collateral consequences of registration notification as they're applied to youth. And we are doing this by looking at this from multiple perspectives. We are going to be talking to youth and their caregivers. We've surveyed practitioners, and we have a young adult survey that's also part of this study. And I'm going to go through this part relatively quickly so we can show you some preliminary results and talk about where our study is heading. But our basic idea of our study is to look at how registration notification affects attitudes, mental health, social and academic stability, and adjustment of youth who have sexually offended. We're also very interested in looking at the effects on families as well that go beyond the youth. I'm going to talk about the first part of our study and then turn it over to Elizabeth to talk about the second part. We did an online provider survey that we launched sometime at the beginning of last year. And here we basically just asked providers about their perspectives on the impacts of registration notification on their clients. I'll just show you some preliminary data. I want to go through this part relatively quickly so we can get to the youth part. We had data from 220.
Hey, Andy, this is Joan. I just want to give this is sort of your 3-minute warning here till the end. So okay. I know you're trying to rush through things, but yeah. And we can extend the time a little bit, but that shortens our Q&A, which is important. So I just wanted to give you that.
Absolutely, I'm going to get through this relatively quickly. And so we surveyed a number of 223 practitioners in 44 states. I'll skip over this information and really just get to specifics. Among the practitioners that we spoke to, they indicated that about a quarter of their clients, registration is fairly typical. And let's just get down to the meat of this. So we asked them about a number of things, including the items that you see listed up here under the scales. And we lumped these into, we developed scales along 4 different dimensions: mental health, harassment, school problems, living instability, and reoffending risk. And I'll go through these again relatively quickly. And again, these Prezi is available for anybody who wants to look at this in a more leisurely way. But I just want to get to the main points here, which is that no matter where you look, these effects were designated by the treatment providers as being very significant. The red line is subjecting youth to public notification. The blue line is simply requiring youth to register. And so the difference between those two is effectively what you can view as the incremental effect of notification. And really across the board, you can kind of see, no matter what you look at, mental health, harassment experiences, school problems, living instability, and reoffending risk, which is perhaps probably the smallest effect that we found among all these things. You see that that providers are indicated that both registration and notification have significant effects, but there is a significant incremental effect of the notification piece. Elizabeth, do you want to take over now?
Sure. And so, again, just to reiterate what Andy said, most practitioners believed that both registration and notification negatively influence children along all of those mental health, harassment, living instability areas. And then we also are looking at what kids and their caregivers report. And so we only have 52 youth in the study right now. And what we have found, if we can move to that table.
Okay.
We have 52 youth, and we have about 78 young adults, 18 to 21 years of age. And if we just move straight to the results section, we've combined those two samples. So we have a sample of about 135 youth and young adults. And what we find is that for the participants who had any registration burden versus participants who had none, the kids and the young adults who had registration burden were worse on our scales of hopelessness, significantly worse on our scales of emotional symptoms, including depression and anxiety. They had a lower sense of safety, personal safety, more likely to endorse hyperactive or inattention symptoms, had more conduct problems, and then also the only positive note, a little more prosocial peers. But by and large, what we are finding, even with the small sample, and even at just the basic any registration or notification requirements versus none, are statistically significant trends or significant findings on these kinds of scales. But this is a small sample, and we would really like to disaggregate the youth from the young adults. And to do that, we've got to get more kids in this study. We've been recruiting in this study for a year and a half now. What we need very much are referrals for kids and their caregivers, kids who are 12 to 17 years of age and their caregivers. The kid has to be in treatment, and it has to be a community-based treatment, not a residential or imprisonment. It's just a 25-minute survey that we ask the kids to complete. Caregivers complete a separate survey on the impacts on them. And the family receives a $25 gift card, Amazon gift card, for their participation. It's a one-shot deal. We can do everything over the phone. If they're close enough, we can also do it in person with our research assistants. But to really move this science forward, we've got to get more referrals. And so we're hoping that many of you in the audience will be willing to reach out and contact us and help us facilitate referrals from your own caseloads and that of your colleagues. Joan, I think that's it. There's our email addresses. We're both pretty easy to find. We're both, of course, ATSA members, so you can look us up if you're an ATSA member on that, or access us any number of ways.
Right. The other thing I would just add is that regardless of what your role is, we can use your help. And
Yeah.
so we've been getting referrals from community-based treatment providers who are we call direct referrals. But even those of you who are working in residential settings, if you have networks of youth who you're still in touch with, if you have colleagues out in the community, really kind of anybody who kind of has worked or has worked with these youth, we can use your help, and please feel free to contact us.
Great. Thank you. Thank you both. That was great. I know you were trying to cover a ton of information in a very short amount of time. And so I want to just repeat again that, that the full Prezi presentation is on the NERI Press website. So you can go back through that as well.
Joan, can
yeah?
I also just add, for the practitioner information, we do have a manuscript that's going to be submitted for publication relatively soon. So, we'll be publishing on these results as well.
Great. So I appreciate that, and just I guess a lot of questions are coming through. Excuse me while I'm playing around with my machine here a little bit. But I wanted to say that one of the things that people are asking, one of the questions that are coming through here is that basically, do participants have to be in any particular state? So maybe if you can talk a little bit about sort of your ideal sort of person to work with, and are there any sort of restrictions that you have? What's the ideal clinician that you might be looking for to collaborate in this research?
So I can take that on, and Andy can rehabilitate me if I need it. Really, anyone who can refer us a client is the ideal referral source, honestly. We would like our sample to cover the entire United States. Importantly, as you all know, registration and notification laws vary by state, often quite widely. And what we want is to really have a definitive word on the collateral consequences of these policies. What I very much don't want to hear from some state is, well, our policy is different and you didn't have any kids from our state, so your results don't apply to us. And I do hear exactly that kind of critique when I'm an expert witness on the stand, and we also get that kind of critique from manuscript reviewers. So we want this study, we want to be able to say, we have representation of kids from every single state in the United States, and there's not any state that can exempt itself from whatever it is we happen to find. So we need every state. We only have about 17 states represented right now, and we had a slide there, but of course we were trying to pack too much into this talk. So we need your kids. We need kids from every state.
Great. And another question that Ida Dibble-Chin asked about is, do you also include psychopath and sociopaths? Is there any kind of limitation to what kind of kids you want to be working with?
So I would first say, with all due respect to the person who submitted that question, I would not call a child a psychopath or a sociopath. We do know that youth have characteristics that can seem like that, callous, unemotional, but I would not use that language when I was referring to children. That said, any kid who is in treatment for sex offending, whether or not they've been adjudicated, whether or not they have to register, is eligible for this study. If they're in a community-based treatment and we can access their legal guardian to get consent to participate, then the youth is eligible.
Great.
Yeah, and the other thing I would add is that we also have a young adult survey that is available that youth can actually take online, and that's for youth who are of majority age.
18 to 21, yeah. That's really simple.
Yeah. And Greg just reminded me that if Elizabeth, Andrew, if you could put your webcams on too while we're talking, that would be that would be great. So then also just that someone, I can answer this question. Someone else asked, can you post the addresses again? I just want to say that the 2 email addresses that are on the screen right now are the places you can just contact Andy and Elizabeth directly. I can speak personally that they're both very accessible, and we'll get back to you incredibly quick amount of time. I think Andy will do it any time of day or night. I'm not sure when he sleeps.
I will.
And but just to say that if you do know of someone, or either another clinician, or if you know some kids who might be interested in the study, if you have any questions, definitely feel free, because this is such an important study, I think, to be conducted. So the contact information is there. Another question that came through was just because I think just because of time and let people know that, I was basically gave, in our format, we only had a half hour. So I asked Andy and Elizabeth to cover a lot of information in just a very short amount of time. And one person asked, that given that you were giving a lot of really important information around low recidivism rates, and it was a great summary, but it may be hard to trust the conclusions without, validity checks and sample sizes. So is there either a resource list or a way that people can actually get some of the specific studies that were behind the ones that you were referring to earlier in your presentation?
I have a document that basically summarizes my research and that of Michael Caldwell, and that includes all of the full references. And then anyone can, of course, find those references. So I'm happy to send that out, Joan, or to send that to you.
Yeah, the other thing I would say, the validity and sample size issue is clearly, a real pivotal piece in any of this kind of research. And it's really one of the reasons why, we are really, really anxious to, recruit as many youth as we can into this study, because, the validity of our results is really contingent on, and our ability, by the way, to kind of slice and dice our data in a meaningful way is really contingent on us getting a nice, decent-sized sample.
Yeah, and you're saying youth, and just somebody asked if it's males only, or are you looking for males and females? Is there any restrictions there?
Boys and girls, because they're both subjected to registration notification. Although, again, I just want to emphasize, because I find that people seem to miss this. They do not have to be registered. In fact, we do need kids that are not registered, although we have a lot of those. But boys and girls in treatment in a community-based setting for sexually offending behavior, whether or not they're adjudicated, whether or not they're registered.
Great. And there's one question, Andy, either you or maybe I can do this one. Is this are there any organizations in Massachusetts that can help family and youth and professionals working with families understand the registration notification criteria and process? So maybe you can talk about nationally where there's some resources, and I can certainly talk about Massachusetts if you want.
Nationally, I'm not. Elizabeth, do you have any thoughts about that?
The only national organization that I could think of that would be able to help you identify your state law would be the Department of Justice Smart Office. And I honestly don't know how well they're set up, but they may well be set up to take questions from citizens. Otherwise, you need to find someone in your state. I don't know of a national resource that
if the question is determining what the registration laws are, there is some information actually in the Human Rights Watch report where Nicole actually did do a survey of the states and their various juvenile registration provisions. That's out there. There are a couple of other places where that exists. As far as support for families, Joan, I'll have to kind of punt that one to you.
Okay. Well, I think in terms of information, certainly the ATSA has a chapter in Massachusetts, which is the Massachusetts Association for the Treatment of Sexual Abusers, and their website is matsa.org. There's also an organization in Massachusetts called MASOC. It's MASOC, and I'll email these out to you as well, Bethany. And on their website, there's some information, and also you can. We have an annual conference where there's actually a lot of, usually at least a workshop or two for the professionals who want to just learn and understand more about notification and registration. And certainly, I'll send you the information. You can contact either organization, and someone would get back to you on that as well. But I think that it sort of shows the question. It's a great question, and shows why why so many families are faced with such difficult issues, because it's even hard to understand how they'll be affected. Another question that came in, a little bit, earlier in terms of the, to go through it. So just so there, are there any sort of support groups that around the country for people who are subjected to registration? And just wondering if you have any sort of thoughts about that.
There are support groups for family members, and I can't recall their names, however, offhand, and I'm sorry about that. But there are some, but I can't think of anything, and specifically for folks who are registered, not just for family members, I don't know.
Yeah, in my understanding, there's actually not a lot of formalized things. This is something which almost changes, sort of almost seems like jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So I would say, again, to do what you can to actually Google, find out your local contacts, and there are there's a number of different sort of organizations that are just beginning to emerge. There's also some actually really wonderful articles that you'll see in some of the newspapers. I know that I think the New York Times did a wonderful piece a number of years ago, and so I would say just start Googling, and you can. There's not a lot of things out there, but there are some. Here's a more research-based question, which I'm comfortable with. Is this? Do you have any findings explaining why the arrest percentages are higher than the convictions?
Well, that's always true, because lots of arrests don't result in conviction for a lot of reasons, right? I mean, Andy's a criminologist. I should let you take that one.
Yeah, I mean, typically arrest data is obviously more common because, right, as things kind of flow through the process. I think we also have to recognize that even arrest data has its own very significant limitations to it, particularly because of the kind of the rates of underreporting.
Yeah, and I think that as I understand it, this is true for not just sex offenses, but it'll be true for almost any offenses.
Right. Yeah.
Great. Emma Beneke actually suggested here that the National District Attorneys Association has a listing of state statutes related to this topic, and gives the address for that. So I'm going to actually just reply all, and so this should show up hopefully. So thank you, Emma, for giving us that particular link. And so looking at the NDAA for listing of sort of state statutes might be able to give you another resource for people who are looking to really research this. And I really appreciate that people are asking that question. And I think that it really is so essential that every clinician working with this population understands the policies and the public policies and the impact that will have on the client. So,
right. And along the lines of the NDAA resource, the National Conference of State Legislatures also operates a sex offender law enactments database. So if you actually just Google sex offender law enactments database, NCSL, you'll come across it, and you can actually kind of slice and dice and sort. And that's actually a really good resource to kind of see what's been happening on the legislative front. And in fact, I think there's even a drop-down portion of that for juveniles.
And I would just add that one thing that we know is that you can read a state's policy, their law, and it may be enacted, it may be implemented very differently than it's written. So, for example, Oklahoma has a law that permits the registration of youth, but the way they've decided to implement is that any kid deemed eligible for registration first is provided treatment, and only if that kid fails in treatment does he or she then get considered for actual registration. And so as a consequence of setting up the policy that way, which is an excellent way to, if you're going to have registration, treatment should be a requirement before registration. It's a good policy. But as a result, they actually register very, very few youth in that state, even though if you read the law, it looks very similar to the laws of states that register a lot of kids. So implementation can vary widely from what is actually in the black and white policy.
Great, thank you. And I'm just wondering, we only have a few more minutes, and I just wonder if you may want to just describe, just talk a little bit again about maybe the importance of, or how you see this research, depending on what the results, how you see this research might be used if we actually have this information. I know, as you mentioned earlier in the presentation, we really don't have the research to say what the real impact of these laws are on adolescents. So maybe start with you, Elizabeth?
Sure, and one thing that I think is very important is, one is just a fundamental duty, I think, to identify the actual consequences of these policies, to ensure that if we're doing harm, we understand that. The policies themselves often are justified as harmless, as not punishment. And in fact, they're upheld at the Supreme Court level as not punishment. And I've heard, and others of you have heard, lawmakers say it's no more onerous to register than it is to go to the Department of Motor Vehicles and get your license. And anecdotally, we have heard very different accounts of the consequences of these policies. But until we document those in a way that is rigorous, scientifically rigorous, you really cannot make an argument that they do have collateral consequences. So, I'm not saying that they do. I certainly think that they do, but we need the research and the science to support that if we're going to go back to policymakers and say, the sin fact does seem to have very punishing effects on youth and on family members. And that needs to be taken into consideration as states decide whether or not to register youth, whether or not to subject them to notification, or whether or not to modify or perhaps even discard those policies.
Yeah. The other thing I'd add to that is that, so we have kind of the policy advocacy piece, but we also have a practice piece to this too, particularly in the courtroom, because, ideally, for a sane policy, we want something that's going to be giving a lot more discretion to prosecutors, judges, and others who are kind of making decisions about the lives of youth. And, one of the things I've heard from colleagues who again work in the legal environment is they don't always have the evidence to counter the assertion that, well, this registration is harmless, right? And so it has this kind of very ground level implication as well, because the more research evidence there is that can be pointed to, the less you're relying on simply just evaluating, well, what's the risk that this kid presents, okay? You actually can really present a more full picture that can help to inform better decisions on the case level as well.
Yeah, and I certainly know that it's a little, as I learn more and more about this topic, it's a little scary thinking about, like, if you commit offense, even like within one state, it can, how it will be implemented will be changed based on county to county. And being able to have this kind of research to point to, especially when you have expert witnesses, will make a huge difference. We have, unfortunately, we're just about out of time. I think if I have, since one more question just came in, I think we have time for maybe if you can do a really quick, like 1 minute response. Just say, the question was, I may have misunderstood, but what do you attribute they were suggesting the increase in prosocial behaviors after registration. And just want to, like, if you can clarify that, that would be great.
Yeah, I don't think we can attribute anything to that yet. We have a small sample size. It's something that we need to just see if that holds up with with a larger sample.
Great, and I think that speaks to the just how we need everybody on this webinar to, if you can help out and contact either Andy or Elizabeth. I think that'll be a huge help for this research and for getting those larger sample sizes. So I just want to take a minute to just go through a little bit closing here, and to say that we just to let everybody know that we do have at Neary Press a free Research to Practice newsletter. Again, I mentioned earlier, we take each month we take a research article that we see as cutting edge or controversial, and try to write it in a quick summary that's short enough to read over a cup of coffee. Because you've signed up for the webinar, you're automatically signed up for this Neary News. It comes only once a month, so we won't invade your email box, but that if you want to unsubscribe, that's fairly easy to do. Just a couple of housekeeping reminders that we will post, the presentation is posted on the website. A recording will be next week, and then also try to post, Elizabeth, you can get us that listing of research articles that might be helpful here. Then we can also post that on our website as well. Or I think Andy may have said that. I also want to just say that we've just finalized our webinar series for next year, with the 2014-15 year. This gives you a sense of some of the people who will be presenting. Includes lots of really wonderful, internationally known and recognized researchers, as well as trainers, including Jerry Blanchard, Robin Wilson, David Prescott, Deborah Hafner, Cordelia Anderson, Phil Rich, David Burton, Steve Benjus, and I guess I say myself too, and talking about bystander work. We'd love, if you'd like to become a sponsor, and if you're interested in being a sponsor for next year's series, please contact us directly at info@nearypress.org. As a thank you, we'll send you copies of 2 of our books, Current Applications and Current Perspective series. Also, you'll be guaranteed a seat in online webinars. And for this next series, we actually will also be able to offer you 9 continuing education credits for attending online webinars or the recordings of those. The cost to you is, for individuals, is $98, and for organizations $250. We think it's really a win-win situation, so we hope you think you'll become a sponsor for next year, but that's how we do these free webinars. And a quick thank you to our sponsors for this year, which include the United Methodist Family Services, St. Joseph Orphanage, James R. Reynolds, Central New York Psychiatric Center, the Durham Family Court Clinic, the Center for Clinical and Forensic Services, the ITM Group, and the Branch Airlo Society. Really want to say thank you to all of these sponsors for this year's series. And last, I just want to say a huge thank you to Elizabeth and to Andy for such a great webinar. And thank you everyone who's on the web conference. We really welcome your feedback, and we really would welcome your participation in this research study. So please, if you do have someone in mind, or if you just have any questions, Andy and Elizabeth are really accessible. I'm hoping, Andy and Elizabeth, that your email boxes will be flooded after this webinar. But thank you both for this really great webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure.
Great. Great. And everybody, don't forget to sign out so you can fill out the feedback form. And Andy and Elizabeth will talk to you in a minute on the conference call line. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.